It spent a lot of time with my grandmother over the years. My parents and I always went home as often as we could. Her house used to sit up on a hill all by itself, and from a road it looked a little spooky, especially at night. When I was younger, I spent my summers with her, and I would hear noises in the middle of the night, but I always thought it was my imagination. I heard what sounded like someone walking down the hall several times over the years, and whispers as if someone was talking about something I wasn't supposed to hear. I thought it was my grandma and grandpa talking while they were laying in bed, and the only reason I could hear was because my room was across the hall from theirs. The thing that freaked me out the most was the night I was laying awake, unable to sleep, and I heard what sounded like someone moving things around on the kitchen counters. I immediately got up and locked my bedroom door. I never said anything to my grandma because I figured she'd think it was my mind working overtime. On one of our 4-day weekends, my parents and I drove up to grandma's house. I was 16 years old at the time and really wanted to spend a weekend at home and hang out with my boyfriend. So when the phone rang later that night, I ran to answer it, figuring it was him. I picked up the receiver and said hello as I usually would, since I had no way of knowing who it was as my grandma didn't have caller ID. I didn't get an answer, so I said hello again, and this time I got static like when you turn your TV to a channel that has no reception. I said hello a couple more times and then hung up. I figured it was just a bad connection, and if it was important, they would call back. I decided to go get a shower and hoped he would call me soon. As I was getting dressed, the phone rang again, so I ran to my room to answer it, thinking it was him. I picked it up and said hello, and all I heard was static again, but it was louder this time. I listened for a minute or so, still thinking it was a bad connection, and then it stopped, and I heard the tone you get when someone hangs up on you. I hung the phone up and went out to the living room and told my dad about it, thinking someone was prank calling us. There really wasn't a lot we could do anyway since we had no way of knowing who it was, but my dad said he'd answer from then on. Eventually, my boyfriend called, and I put it in the back of my mind. We had a good weekend, but it passed quick, and before I knew it, we were getting ready to go back to Florida. I remember I had just gotten dressed and pulled my suitcase into the living room for my dad to pack. When we got done with breakfast, we were sitting down eating and waiting for my aunt and cousins to come over before we left. So when the doorbell rang, that's who we expected to see when my mom opened the door. But no one was there. She said, Dee, run out to the laundry room and see if they're at that door and when. I opened it again. No one was there. I walked back into the living room alone. And my mom looked at me funny and looked at my dad like, what is going on? He went out the front to see if anyone was there, and he didn't find anyone. I pulled my mom aside and told her about the phone calls a few nights before, and now the doorbell ringing when no one was there. It was weird. She was concerned about someone trying to see who was home so they could break in. There had been a few attempts over the years. My grandpa and my dad both checked to see if maybe there was a short in the doorbell, and they couldn't find anything wrong. In fact, it never shorted out the rest of the time my grandma lived there. If it had just been the phone calls alone, I wouldn't really think much of it. But add the doorbell in, and it just doesn't make sense. There were several other things that occurred over the years that I had put in the back of my mind up until I had the visitor in my room and started to become aware of things. I know now that it was happening to me and around me for far longer than I knew. Ahave had encounters with the spirit realm since I was a child, and as a result I have developed some degree of ability for sensing their presence, their mood or intention, and occasionally more distinguishing personal characteristics. I am pretty certain that there are at least two spirits that seem attached to me personally, not my location. One is benign and a prankster. I rarely know when it is present or anything about it personally, usually only afterwards when I have to deal with the results of its mildly annoying pranks. But I wanted to write the story about the other one. This one is a malevolent entity, and its intent is always to try to frighten me, usually in very devious and clever ways. It also seems to an ever-increasing frustration level when I refuse to acknowledge it. Two incidents stand out among the others, but I will only describe in detail the second incident, which was far worse. The first one happened in the late morning. I decided to go into my bedroom and read. After a moment, I must have fallen asleep, though not deeply. I was suddenly aware of many human-like spirits of all ages. Sexes and races entering into my room and through my walls, wailing and crying in sorrow. They just kept coming, until there seemed to be dozens, and the wailing was very loud. At this point, I felt very much awake, though in a trance-like state. I even had the presence of mind to glance over at my digital clock and read the time. I had only been in there a few minutes. Eventually, one of the spirits, a male from a voice, leaned over into my ear and let out this blood-curdling screech. It was so ear-shattering and disturbing that I was finally able to break loose from the trance and fling myself out my room. I was alarmed by this experience, but not exactly afraid. I do not much fear the otherworldly. The second incident happened about 3 weeks later, and it was probably the most horrifying I have ever had. It began at night, as I was settling in for bed, reading a book. The lamp was on, so there were no shadows or darkness. I felt something run across the end of my bed. It had the weight of a medium-sized dog, but the quickness of a cat. I caught just a glimpse of the creature, completely black and lacking true form as it darted across the bed. It happened quickly, and I immediately figured that my black cat had managed to sneak into my room, as I keep the door shut at all times to keep my 2 cats out. I got up to check to see if the cats were in the room, and found them both napping on the couch in the living room. I felt suddenly ill at ease and decided to take my little heavy black flashlight into my room with me. I returned to bed and eventually turned out the lights. Almost immediately, the disturbances began. There was knocking on my headboard and the walls, voices, shapes, and black figures that would loom over the foot of my bed, and my bed would shake. Using my previous experiences, I was determined not to leave my room, or show fear, or even turn on my light. In fact, I felt more annoyance than anything, and any time the ruckus started up, I would shine my flashlight in the direction of the disturbance and force myself to think positive thoughts. This went on all night, and I got very little sleep until finally the sun came up and the disturbances all but ceased. It just happened to be Christmas Eve, and my car was in the shop. Most of my apartment neighbors were away visiting for the holidays, and I was basically alone in the whole complex. Recently, I've been having an uprise in paranormal activity, which has suddenly caused me to rethink one of my other paranormal encounters. I published a story on this encounter, Abby called Amy and Her Dolls. When I was younger, I believed Amy was introduced to me through a set of dolls I received from her grandma. When I moved, I believed Amy had become malicious because she was no longer near her grandma. Recent events have brought me to question if it was really Amy who was the malicious spirit. I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, the beginning of August into a brand new apartment complex. I am the first resident in this apartment, and the activity I've encountered makes me think a spirit followed me from Iowa. The first encounter was actually with my puppy. He has a habit of taking his toy ball and sitting at the feet of people, squeaking it obnoxiously until they throw it for him so he can fetch. If you ignore him, he'll paw at your leg. Starting in the middle of September, he started doing this in the middle of the living room facing absolutely nothing. He'd even whine and start pawing. Because my puppy is still potty training, we keep him in his kennel all night, and I put his toys away onto the kitchen counter. There is no way he can knock them down, but in the morning I'll find the majority of his toys pushed underneath the couch with no explanation. The way my kitchen is set up to the living makes it impossible for the toys to have been knocked down off the counter and roll under the couch. Someone physically put them there. Just this last week, I began having a repeating dream. I was back in my house in Iowa, 6 years old, trying to hide someplace in my house from the monster. Each time, right when the monster would almost find me, I'd wake up to hear someone whispering my name. At first, I thought it might be my boyfriend just trying to stop my nightmare, but he doesn't recall saying my name. He's even told me that he thought he heard my name whispered the other night while I was sleeping, and shortly after I came out from the bedroom. I invited one of my friends over. I met her when I moved here, and she ended up staying the night. In the morning, she asked me, "Who's Amy?" I asked her what she meant. I thought she meant a person. She claimed that she had an encounter in the night with a spirit named Amy, who was walking between my bedroom and living room. These experiences have brought me to question what really happened when I was younger. Maybe Amy is my guardian, so to speak, but then that brings a question. Who was the spirit that traumatized me when I was younger? Any theories on this would be extremely appreciated. One night, I was getting ready for bed, getting dressed and running back and forth to the bathroom. I finally got everything together for the next morning and made my way to the living room, picking on my brothers, Devin and Cameron, on the way. We had recently gotten a toy poodle, Precious, about 5 months back, and she was asleep with my mom in my parents' bedroom, on the foot of the bed as usual. My dad was away on a business trip, and so it was my brothers and I were in the living room watching TV. My mom had gone to bed about 30 minutes before, and I started to hear Precious barking furiously. I heard my mother yell, fear in her voice, "Megan, get this dog out of here." I rushed to my parents' bedroom. The lights were off, so with the dim light from the hall shining into the room, I couldn't see much. But Precious continued to bark as if she was about to attack someone. I was so confused, and I could feel my mother's fear. I quickly turned on the master bath's light and looked to see what was going on. Precious's, for sticking straight up, was barking and leaping toward the corner of the room, closest to my mom's bed. She would dodge and act as if something was coming for her, continue to bark at the corner of the room. I scooped her up, and she abruptly stopped barking. I was consoling her, and I looked at my mother finally. Her eyes were big, and she was pressed up against the headboard of the bed, looking terrified and confused. I have never seen my mother scared except for the time my youngest brother almost choked to death on an everlasting gobstopper. But the expression on her face washed away all my doubt that this could be explained, that this was something natural. Precious never slept within my parents' room again. I was wondering if this certain event could possibly coincide with one time my mom went to bed early. I don't think anyone else was home. She said she fell asleep and she was on her back. She had a dream of a blue outline of a man, came up to the side of her bed and reached down to her waist and started squeezing the breath out of her. My mom was trying to wiggle free. She woke herself up. Thinking the dream was over, the breath was still being squeezed out of her. She looked up, and there was the blue outline of the man. He let go of her and slowly disappeared. She told me about how it scared her so. My brothers and I were repelled from my parents' room, which was at the end of the hall. It always felt darker and more closed than the rest of the house. We ran from it after shutting the door, the hair standing up on the back of our necks. Devin, the older of the two, denied his fear of Mom and Dad's room. But one day, he could not deny it any longer. Devin, Cameron, and I were playing in the hallway one day. I would say I was about 14. Devin was 7 and Cameron 6. It was a sunny day and the windows were up and the sun shining through, ghosts far from mine and Cameron's minds. My parents' bedroom door was slightly open, and you could see sunlight spilling through one of the 2 windows onto the floor. Both of my parents were at work at the time, so we were doing whatever we pleased. Devin had just asked me a question about what was vanquished from my mind when I heard a man's deep voice come from my parents' room and say one single word. In that very moment, I knew what he'd said, and the goosebumps popped up all over my body at light speed. Quickly looking at my brothers, who'd stopped in mid-movement, eyes wide. Devin's eyes were as round as quarters in Cameron, and I looked at him knowing that he now knew, that we, in a way, had proof to proving the things we talked about seeing and hearing, that they were not figments of our imaginations. You could tell in that moment he believed. Devin shot up from the floor and bolted from the hall screaming, Cameron and I on his heels. We sat in the living room out of breath and not saying a word, listening for whatever it was that had spoken from my parents' room. Devin finally spoke, breaking the heavy silence. What was that, and what did it say? I could not recall for the life of me what the voice had said to us, and I racked my memory at least once a week trying to think of what it could have been. This is one of the first voices I heard, but the last Devin ever experienced. He will not speak of the event again and denies the voice he heard. My 2 sisters have recently become interested in ghosts and have taken one of those ghost recorders to a few places supposed to be haunted. I'm not as into it as much as they, but for my birthday, they bought me one of those small recorders. So a few days ago, I decided to go down to the cemetery near my home and give it a try, only I never expected anything of it. I walked around a while, then laid it down by one of the graves and hit the record button and walked to the other side of the cemetery, just checking out some really old graves. No one was there, just myself, and it's a cemetery way out in the country. About 10 or so minutes later, I was getting bored and it was getting late in the evening. So I went back across the cemetery and picked up the recorder, then hit the off button and came home. At home, I hit play, and about 6 minutes later, this man's voice says, "I'm here in," then like a 2-second pause. He says, "The church. There's a church right across from the cemetery." I thought I might faint there for a minute. The next day, I took it to both my sisters' homes so they could hear my ghost, and they were so excited about it. I'm just scared because my husband works out of town a lot. So I stay by myself a lot of nights, and I don't want that ghost here for sure. But at the same time, I want to know why this ghost man wanted me to know he was in the church. Anyone on this site have any ideas about this? If I go back there, he might say something again, but I'm way too scared. How can I be sure he, S.A. Good Ghost,